is that Coco told us yesterday that up till now we still cannot clean up under the bridge, the area under the bridge.
That integration of the mental health component into primary health services has been recommended by WHO since many years, and then it's like before, if you remember from Almata 1978, like the primary health care included 8 components like water, sanitation, communicable diseases, immunization, and all that. And then the last thing which has been added recently is the mental health component. Now in different countries, like developing countries, primary health services usually have community health volunteers who are trained in basic, health in health promotion, basic medical care, and they routinely do home visits to the community. So if you can work with the community health volunteers in the primary health care services, then you can reach more number of people. I think it's more effective if the integration is linked to larger health reform, because I've seen, like, for example, in South Africa, like, it has been integrated in the mental health component has been integrated primary health services. But when you look at what has made it more successful is that there was overall health reform happening, which led to focus of the whole funding of health services more focused on the primary health care level, not on the tertiary or secondary levels. So that kind of bigger frame, changes in the mentality at the policy level, help to support. But if you just do it only on mental health part, then it's very difficult. The other thing is, like, it should include the community education. People have their own explanations of the mental illness, as I was mentioned before, and there is always, like, socially accepted behavior of seeking care, and you have to understand that, like, what is the common social behavior, and how we do it. It's like, for example, when you talk, like, when you talk to different people, how they came to primary health care services, you actually find out that they have tried different, approaches. They tried to self-treatment. They went to traditional providers, or it took a very long time for them to come to primary health care services or something. So, but among all those kind of different varieties, there is always kind of not one, but more or less like several commonly accepted behavior. And I think that's you have to know when you design the program, whether, like, when you're referring to people to primary health care, whether would be the people going there, is it accepted behavior in the community? The government have more concern for the security than for anything else, or, like, the containment of the outbreak of infectious diseases. And there are so many, like, other competing needs that they got, that the psychological component kind of gets pushed away, like, to the side. I think, like, for example, I see, like, sometimes programs, say psychological programs, say we want to work with everyone else, and we are, like, we are like different from everybody else, and we welcome everybody's collaboration. And that's not feasible, because, like, in the forging relationship, it means, like, having meetings, long meetings, and paying visits to offices, and that's, like, a lot of time and investment, and that's not feasible for programs. So you have to identify a few strategic partnerships, not everybody else, and that's very important. And the other thing is to assess the capacity of the organizations you are working with, in terms of the human capacity and logistical, and also in terms of the organizational values. In terms of the, I think we discussed before, it's the aligned program strategies with national policy direction, for example, mental health policy, as Rushika was saying, the education policy, right? So these kind of plans, national strategies or guidelines, and then emphasize capacity building of public health services, and have collaborative program evaluations. And because I think we in the morning touched on that, right, Mike? You mentioned about how now the projects are doing collaborative evaluations, and I think it's one way of integrating or working together with. Because, for example, this program, because what happens is when there are so many multiple actors in one geographic area, there are so many similar interventions happening, and it's very difficult to know what intervention, if your intervention made a difference or not. So it's better for everyone else get together and do overall assessment, overall evaluation in the area or in the specific technical area or geographic area, and then you will know whether you made a difference on collectively, but you will not be able to know if your organization did more or less than other something.
First, I'll ask you a question. This question is my supervisor asked me in the SARS period. What's psychological aid in emergent catastrophes? If we want to give them a very formal answer, it's quite different, quite difficult, and maybe the answer is different. But from an angle to answer it, we can see a group of panic people help a group of more panic people. Yeah?
Yeah, that's right.
We are people. We are real human beings. So we cannot feel nothing. We'll feel tsunami too. So we just have more knowledge, more consideration on the condition. So we must do basing on we are human too. Maybe to public will be backbone. I've said at the beginning, we are panic group people, but maybe we face a group of more panic group of people. So we are their backbone. Even we are fear, we are terrible. So, to patients or survivors, I think will be as a role of balance. Why could balance? In China, there's a character as it's the Chinese characters. It means combined several components into one, but peaceful and safety things. So maybe psychologists can do these things at that time. Okay. We balance so much things, their emotion and behavior, their feeling and the fact, and they do something to want the government, to want any other people. We must balance all the conditions. Yeah, especially as acute stage. Yes. To the government, maybe so many psychologists in China at that time, first time, became very poor. Because at the beginning, the government, some reaction is not very correct. After the end of the April, more information provided by the Chinese psychology to the government. Maybe they can adjust the policy to face such things.
the first step is indeed the assessment of the target community. If you have a community that you're intending to serve, finding out not only what their needs are, but what their strengths are. Because assessment is not just about the weaknesses or the needs that need to be strengthened, it's also about what strengths and resources communities bring to the table. And that's particularly important if you're talking about a community-based intervention, because you want to build on the strengths of the community and fill in where you need to with other skills training, but the key is to build on the strengths the community brings to the table. The design of the program, done in consultation with local residents, leaders, and experts. Implementation of the program, evaluation of the program, adjustment of the program, evaluation of the program, adjustment of the program, on and on and on and on. The evaluation process does not stop. And that's an important thing to understand. One of the common issues that we hear about is it's so hard to get funding for psychological support because the donors don't understand psychological support. And if you give somebody 5 pounds of rice, they understand that. But if you give them 5 pounds of psychological support, how do you measure that? Well, part of the answer is you develop a good assessment of needs and evaluation of the program assessment package, and you continue that evaluation and assessment, and you demonstrate scientifically the changes that are being made as a result of the program that you're implementing. The evaluation process needs to be ongoing to demonstrate the continued effectiveness of the program. And to ensure that we are sensitive to the changing needs of the community across the life of an event and the recovery process of the community, because their needs change, and therefore the psychological support program needs to change as well. And if we're going to most effectively use our resources to serve the people, we need to have a good system of evaluation to help us to do that. When I go into a community following a disaster, I try to do a very quick assessment that may involve discussions with a handful of people that I try to choose from different segments of the community to get a very quick idea of what the community itself is like, regardless of the disaster. And in my experience, communities have personalities. And if you can learn about the personality of that community, it helps you to understand how they are going to respond to the incident. What are the strengths and weaknesses of the community? Again, pre-existing issues. What mental health resources are there? And I'm not just talking about mental health professionals, but what are all the sources of psychological support that the community normally turns to? What is the power structure? What are the networks in the community? We must be very careful to protect the members of the community who have a weaker voice. And so we need to ensure that we assess the community in that process so that those who don't have power still have an opportunity to express their voice. In many cases, the assessment process needs to be qualitative. Talking to people about what their needs are, what they see as things that the community needs to build and recover from an event or to prepare for an event, depending upon the phase of an operation in which you're working. And sometimes scientists get rather snobbish about qualitative data. And they say, well, you know, if it's not quantitative data, it's not scientific. But there is a very, very large body of qualitative research. There are very rigorous techniques for conducting qualitative research. There are even statistical analysis programs for qualitative research. And so do not be too quick to dismiss qualitative data, especially since it's probably the majority of what you're going to be able to collect. There is a tendency by researchers to take an assessment instrument that has been developed in some part of the world and take it into another part of the world, translate the words, and apply it, which isn't valid. It just isn't. If you simply translate, that instrument may not make sense to the people that you're intending to assess. And so there's a whole process of the adaptation of the instrument to the culture. Even the translation process, I've seen a number of teams that have done translations, and they did very careful translations with teams of translators who all agreed, and then they went out and did the field test, and the instrument was a catastrophe because the translators didn't speak the same local language as the people they were assessing. In addition to that, they didn't do back translation. So you translate, and then you have someone take the translation and see if they can interpret it back into English to see if it measures the same concepts. And you can actually have a lot of fun with that because by the time it gets back into English, it's often a different instrument altogether. But after you get all the language issues settled, you get a difference in how you communicate the emotions or the cognitions or the behavior or the physical condition. Then you have to test its validity with the population, because now that you've got something that makes sense, it may not be a good assessment instrument. So developing the quantitative objective instruments for use in a situation can be a lengthy process. After the data collection, if you have a team collecting data, and this is kind of an idealistic model, you gather at the end of the day and you discuss what you're learning in the evaluation process. You share both the data and the viewpoints that you've developed or are developing in the course of the day. You also strategize on how to adapt the assessment for the remaining data collection. Again, as I say, my experiences and what I've heard from many other professionals is that the assessment process evolves as it is being conducted based upon their experience with different components of the community. Would the evaluation benefit from altering the structured interview? Be open to the possibilities, be flexible. When you get down to analyzing the data, what do the data say about the attainment and completion of goals and objectives? What steps can be taken to improve the intervention program? Who is responsible for those steps? That's not WHO is responsible for those steps, but who is responsible for those steps? How can the feedback be most beneficially provided? And trying to make sure there's very clear communication within the team. Very important aspect to arrive at a good summary of the assessment. Reach a comfortable decision within the team about how feedback will be prepared for the community, as well as for the sponsoring organizations, the donor organizations. Prepare a written report which can be used. Share a preliminary report with a program representative. If you're doing an evaluation of a psychological support program, I want to strongly urge you to go over your evaluation with them before you submit it to the donor organization, before you submit a final copy. I have seen numerous examples in which there were conclusions made by an assessment team that were simply wrong, flat out, absolutely wrong. And that could have been corrected by simply presenting those conclusions to the program and letting them explain why they were wrong. Assess the value of and deal with feedback from that process, and then share the report with the program and follow up with the program. Now, I haven't designed in here, but I know that in many cases that will also be shared with the donor. I guess that is of less concern to me than the support for the program. But I know that it's all integrally linked. Discuss with the program goals and objectives to be assessed at the next evaluation. So each time you conduct an evaluation process, you then talk about what will we do next time? How will this change? How will the evaluation be conducted to be more valuable to you the next time that you have an evaluation? So what are the guidelines then about when you seek a higher level of help? Seek some professional assistance when unpleasant symptoms last more than 4 to 6 weeks. Now the question is 4 to 6 weeks from when? And we usually talk about the end of the event. Well, is the event over, in Sri Lanka at this point? Maybe not. If you're still living in a tent, in a camp, maybe the event's not over yet. When it becomes difficult to function effectively on the job or at home or at school, when an individual feels concerned about his or her behaviors and emotions, and again suggesting 10 to 30% meet those criteria. Now, there's some new research out that is suggesting that we're seeing the numbers of people who report having the need for psychological support is increasing in the United States. So that we're finding in some of the studies it's coming up as high as 45%. And we think in part that's because people are being given permission to seek help. They're being told that that's okay. It's not a sign of weakness, it's a sign of being human. Part of what I hope that we will do is also to educate mental health professionals to what traumatic stress is. And in fact, in the psychological first aid programs, the basic model we talk about, we teach the general public what traumatic stress reactions are so that they know what's unusual and what's extraordinary. And I think that's profitable. But when I started in disaster, I had this belief in my head that all mental health professionals were trained in traumatic stress because I thought everybody received the same training that I did. And of course that was pretty stupid and naive, but the fact is that the training that different mental health professionals receive is very different, and they're trained in some things I'm not, and lots of people in our professions are not trained in traumatic stress. I think we need to raise the level of awareness of traumatic stress reactions so that mental health professionals understand that this is not psychopathology, it's just human behavior. And there's a difference. When people are exposed to traumatic events in these situations, there are effects that take place. It includes those who were directly affected, which we've heard about this morning. Some of you also talked about those who are indirectly affected, talking about the people inland who were not affected by the wave but were traumatized, children watching the television as things were shown over and over. These are common stories in disasters all over the world. And so we have to think about those directly affected but also those who were indirectly affected. And that includes the humanitarian relief workers. Traumatized people cannot help you in recovering from the disaster. They only get in the way and prevent the recovery of the community. And in addition to that, he said, I have lost so many staff because of the secondary trauma, the indirect trauma that my staff experience, that I know that we have to take care of our people as well. So what makes events less stressful? Preparation. There have been a number of studies which have suggested that even brief kinds of training, a couple of hours in length, reduce people's experience of stress in the aftermath of an event. Now, that's training that comes before, okay? People that have had even brief workshops in how to handle themselves following a disaster do much better afterwards. And it's an interesting thing. So you're all getting protected today, right? Training, similar kind of concept, a little more formal perhaps. Teamwork, cooperation, and camaraderie. I think it's hard to underestimate the importance of having colleagues who experience the event with you. And it's really important in the work we do in the National Disaster Team that we form bonds with each other very quickly. And I think that is both intuitive, but it's also very smart because it makes us stronger in resisting the traumatic stress. I just can't emphasize this enough. Being prepared is better than reacting. And I really see the work that you're talking about doing as preparing for the next bad thing that happens more than reacting to the tsunami. That's part of why we want to look at long-term sustainability. I had a lot of people back in 1989 who said it was ridiculous to start disaster mental health in the United States because it would take forever to get going. And my reaction was, if we wait until tomorrow to begin, it will take forever in a day. So let's start today. In Chennai, they were talking about an African proverb that says, the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago. The second best time is today. The humanitarian charter from the Sphere Project, which is the World Guidelines, says that this is what the victims of disaster have a right to expect. And it says that for psychological support, they have the right to expect psychological first aid. And so it's a very clear statement to government leaders that the international guidelines for humanitarian assistance say that psychological first aid is the minimum acceptable psychological support that should be provided to the affected population. Psychological first aid is being used in lots of different ways by different people in different countries. But what we are trying to do is to shape this terminology so that we understand what we mean when people say it. And psychological first aid is grassroots, community-based psychological support provided for family, friends, neighbors, and colleagues by members of the general population. I tend to talk about, in terms of a specific technique, psychological first aid. But part of what I want you to see is that it's not agenda-driven because in the normal plan, we sit down for 9 months with local providers saying which of these pieces seems to make sense to you and which don't. And people, in Korea, they said, well, this entire sixth of what you're doing doesn't make sense, so we're going to take that out. And that's fine. And they reshaped it. We have had, gender things that are talked about. We have had social class things that are talked about that are either put in or removed by different countries. And we're there to serve you in serving your people. And, I don't have an agenda with psychological first aid, except that it seems to be a collection of skills that works and works in many different situations and can be customized to serve your people. Psychological first aid is a very low-cost program. It is a program that does not rely on mental health professionals to provide services. It does rely on them to consult and to do training, but not to provide the direct services. Psychological first aid is the model that was chosen in 1993 by the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies as their model that they proposed as the most likely model to be implemented in developing countries. And they have helped many countries begin that process, and I'll talk about that in a few moments. But the psychological first aid has been proven in cultures in all different religions, all of the major religions that I can identify. In all the continents of the world, this is a successful kind of operation. Disaster relief personnel, community leaders, teachers, first aiders are people who can be taught how to provide psychological support as they do their normal routines. But I will tell you that there are many people who have these roles who may not be the person you want to turn to receive psychological support. The huge majority of people turn to family and friends. That's where most of the support that people get comes from. Next are primary care providers and spiritual leaders, and then some trained volunteers and a few professionals and paraprofessionals, and a very, very tiny number use inpatient services even when they're available, and they're not always available. Principles of psychological support design. Just to repeat this, community-based models. I love the example that was given today about at lunch about the restaurant. You know, imagine that you're in a restaurant and they come and serve you with what they think you want to eat. You know, you would be offended by that. And yet that's what so many agencies do. They come in and say, okay, this is your psychological support model. Well, maybe that's not what they wanted. And we need to give them the menu and say, you know, what do you want from this menu, or what do you want prepared specially? It needs to be sustainable. It needs to serve, now this is a debatable one, serve every resident of the affected area. When I'm trying to design an intervention, I'm trying to serve all of the people. I have some colleagues whom I respect very much who say that this is inappropriate, that you should only expect to serve a small percentage of the affected people. I suggest to you that if you have a good psychological first aid program, you can serve the entire population, not just a small percentage.
Well, why focus on children? I don't know about you, but I begin with the very basic idea of children's rights as outlined in the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. Children do have needs, but I think it's very important to remember that we have obligations to meet their basic rights, and that their rights are entitlements. They can neither be given nor taken away. They are comprehensive, they are indivisible, and these are the things that we have to pay very close attention to. So I'd like to develop a framework that emphasizes vulnerability and resilience, and helps us think about these not as absolute. We should never think of children as resilient or as vulnerable. Every child is both. These are dynamic concepts. A child who's resilient and well-functioning at one moment can become quite vulnerable at another. And likewise, a child who is quite vulnerable at one moment can become quite resilient in another. So my contention is that we need to think about the relative strength of risk factors versus protective factors. When the balance is tipped too far in favor of risk factors, that's when children become at risk of damage, developmental delays, and problems functioning. But when protective factors have the upper hand, we see good functioning. It means that when one thinks about psychosocial programs, one doesn't think about just making an individual well. One thinks about the balance between risk factors and protective factors. If we reduce risks and strengthen protective factors at multiple levels, not just the individual, but family, school, peer group, religious group, ethnic group, and society, then we get much farther. When we think of risk factors, the main issue is risk accumulation. There's good evidence from a wide variety of studies of children that the problem is not the exposure typically to any one particular risk, but rather to an accumulation of risks. There's an exponential relationship between risk accumulation and problems in functioning or developmental delays. So a child who faces 2 risk factors, for example, may be much worse off than a child facing 1 risk factor. But if you add a 3rd risk factor, it turns out that there is an increase in damage to the child that is an order of magnitude greater than that which was true for the 2nd risk factor. So it's not an additive relationship at all. Risks are culturally constructed. People understand risks in very different ways. In the aftermath of displacement in Afghanistan, if one asks young girls, what's your biggest concern? What are the biggest risks? They won't say things like landmines and risk of attack. They'll say things such as my camp or my village has no latrines for young women. And if they, in relieving themselves, show any part of their body, they are permanently disfigured socially, they are shunned, and their families are dishonored. So this is a culturally constructed risk that arises out of the very strict gender norms that exist in Afghan society. And I'm not arguing that that's a good thing, but I'm arguing that this is something that has to be understood. So we should never think of risks with our own eyes. We should try to learn from local people, how do they understand risks and what are most potentially damaging. You know, oftentimes we tend to act as if children who are exposed to life-threatening events react in roughly the same way. And I'd urge us to interrogate that. We know clinically, actually, that it's not true. We know that there's enormous differences, not just from differences in coping and differences in protective factors that are social. A great deal depends upon the meanings that individuals assign to their experiences. And this is one of the reasons why we ought to be using qualitative methods in our rapid assessments, because that gives us a way to interrogate meanings. So for me, it's not just a matter of convenience. Qualitative data are fundamentally stronger than quantitative data for some things. Now, I don't want to say qualitative are better overall than quantitative. I actually have some training in experimental psychology, and I'm a great believer in quantitative measures. But it's in the balance of those two, I think, that we get the best picture. When we think about children, we see a lot of mediation in terms of their family. Overwhelmingly, the children who do worst in any disaster are the children who are being abused at home or who've been separated. Oftentimes, again, we tend to look outside at the big external event, the armed conflict, the tsunami, but we don't look internally. But that turns out to be the thing that mediates children's reactions. So I think we have to look very carefully at relations with family. Culture and meaning, resilience, I've already mentioned. We need to think a lot about destabilized social supports because, as I mentioned before, things go badly when risk factors outweigh protective factors. So when we do our assessments, are we analyzing carefully enough how the social supports have been destabilized and what existing social supports are there that can be built upon? In the vast majority of psychosocial programs that I know of, at least those that are organized by professional psychologists, one very seldom hears the words child protection. And I want to challenge this practice very directly. My experience is that around the world, a key part of good psychosocial intervention is prevention. We know this therapeutically. It makes no sense to patch people up. We're always thinking and challenging ourselves to think in prevention. But the vast majority of psychologists who go in to work on disasters and complex emergencies think about healing, coming to terms, reintegration, reestablishing social support. I'm all for it. It is profoundly important. But it doesn't look at the other side of it. If you take a look at a Sri Lanka, a Tamil Nadu, and even in Indonesia, and I'm quite sure Thailand, you find that there were enormous issues that arose from separation between children and their caretakers. Traffickers moved in, child predators used situations like this to try to select children and to try to exploit them in a whole variety of ways. How can we do psychosocial support if we're not coupling our efforts with systematic efforts to prevent these abuses? Child protection has to go hand in hand with psychosocial support. And on the flip side, people who work on child protection oftentimes have focused primarily on legal and physical risks, and I think we have to interrogate that. Our job as psychologists is to educate and to say that some of the greatest risks actually arise from emotional, social, spiritual kinds of factors that child protection people haven't thought of. I want to make the case that children, when we think about emergency preparedness, as our discourse over the past couple of days has indicated that we have to take seriously, should think of children not as beneficiaries of services, but as actors. They have creativity, they have enormous motivation, they have great capacity, and children in many parts of the developing world, including all the societies represented around this table, I think have a commitment to supporting their families, their communities, and their nations. And that means that children are an untapped resource, largely untapped resource. So child participation, I think we need to think about both as a fundamental right of children, but also as a venue for strengthening emergency response. Okay, well, the big $64,000 question is, what do you do out of all this? So now what I'd like to do is to change gears just a little bit and to ask, how can we get practical? Practically and strategically, what can we do to engage in emergency preparedness and response on a large scale? And I'd like to suggest that community-based intervention makes a lot of sense, first of all, because the wounds of events such as this are not just individual, but they are truly collective. A key issue that I think we need to keep our eyes on is community empowerment, social mobilization. Psychosocial intervention is not just individual, although it is has important individual dimensions. It is social as well. And that means that helping communities to get back on their feet and to help people engage in collective planning and action so that they can take an active role in guiding and achieving their own future. This is very much a platform for development, but it's also very much about healing. If one has been overwhelmed, one of the most effective things that one can do is to regain a sense of efficacy, a sense that events are controllable to some extent, that what I do, what we do, can in fact make a difference in achieving a positive future. Our strategy is to have the rapid assessment phase last only a few weeks and to transition very quickly into rapid response. How do you do that? Well, I don't claim to have the answer, but we do have a model. And I'm going to present a model that talks about child-centered spaces and the importance of non-formal education, because that's something that can be set up literally in a day. Child-centered spaces, what are they? Well, they're known mostly as a form of non-formal education, but I want to develop the idea that they are also a form of psychosocial support and children's protection. And in answer to the question of how do we do something tangible, this is CCF's answer. Local people need to see something practical, And the question that arose the other day was, how do we begin talking about mental health services and about psychosocial well-being? My answer is, would be, you do that. It's terribly important that we do that and that we not do stealth psychosocial assistance. But I would argue that that should follow the establishment of some tangible benefits for children and engagement of adults in activities. It's also a platform for community mobilization and capacity building of local people to protect children. And the interesting thing is that it's a very strategic and non-stigmatizing entry program. At no point does one come in and say, the psychologists have arrived, we're going to help you identify those children who are traumatized, and we're going to help you deal with all these horrendous effects. It's a very non-medical approach, and it builds on the idea that parents love to see constructive activities and educational activities for their children. Children, too, want to see re-engagement in normalizing activities. So one of the things that we do is we set up activities very quickly, and we begin a dialogue with the local group. And this follows a process of cultural entry, of dialogue with chiefs, with elders, with elder women, with youth. And out of that, we identify people who might be trainers, or who might be people who could lead our child-centered spaces. These are local staff. Typically, they're volunteers. Sometimes they're teachers, but not always. The way we select them is through a process of consultation. We ask people, who would you go to if your child were having difficulties or needed some support? And certain names tend to surface again and again and again. And those then become the people whom we tend to seek out as people who would be good local staff. Before that, we engage in a training of trainers with our emergency staff. Our emergency staff are almost always local people who know the local language and situation. The workshops that we conduct, the quote trainings, are really mutual learning spaces. And it's based on the idea that we come in with some psychological knowledge, but local people know very much more about their own situation, their own games, their own activities for children, their understandings of children. And out of that, we try to create participatory methodologies. In terms of activities, if we look at Child Fund Aceh, from the Banda Aceh area, we find very simple activities: drawing, reading, writing poetry, traditional dances, sports, religious lessons, creative games, singing, informal education. All of these are blended in ways that local people have selected. So these weren't things, we don't come in with a package and land it on people. Again, it's an elicitive process. We try to learn from local people what would they like to see, what do they think would be most helpful. And then just to add some faces and some children to some of these activities, these aren't all from Banda Aceh, but what we try to do is we provide several hours of activities every day for children of different age groups, and we do find it important to use different age groups. If you put all the children together, what happens is the teenagers and the bigger, older children dominate, and the younger children get left out. And if you don't pay attention to gender, you find that the boys tend to grab things and get privileges that the girls don't have. And so we really try to pay attention to these things. Some dances and engagements, drawing. For young children, oftentimes what we do is we invite young children to come in with their mothers. And by presenting this as this is something that's good for one's children, mothers get engaged. We don't say to the mothers, you've been horribly affected and overwhelmed by your traumatic experiences, and we want to talk with you about how you've been affected. But in the context of the child-centered space, then, we begin a process of dialogue, consultation, referral, and over time we do increase awareness of psychosocial impacts, and people really become quite relieved to learn that, for example, that if they're having flashbacks or intrusive memories or what other kinds of problems, that those are normal reactions, and that there is hope and there are ways of dealing with it. The use of the cultural games and activities is really important for restoring a sense of cultural identity and restoration, and particularly in situations of armed conflict where the attacks have been structured along the fault lines of ethnicity. It's really important for people to have a sense, to regain a sense of their own identity and to have a sense of positive esteem around that. And that in itself can have a tremendous positive impact. Well, in terms of psychosocial support, the children do regain a sense of normalcy, stability, and hope. That's terribly important because oftentimes, an event like the tsunami that happened on a sunny day, sort of out of the blue with no warning, punctures that view of a safe world. So the reestablishment of a sense of safety and of a place where there's predictability is terribly important. What we've done in CCF is to try to learn from children. And we've constructed a child-led process. And this is something that's constantly being refined as we test it out in different areas. But here's the way it works. If you go into most villages and you ask adults, do they know what are the main protection threats to children? They'll say, oh yes, we know very well. And we'll say, how about for young girls? Oh yes, we know very well. How about for young boys? Oh yes, no problems. And what we do is we engage in a process designed to break that mindset and to help adults understand that there's an adult bias that in a hidden way silences children's viewpoints. And we don't do this to try to put all the power in the hands of children, but to simply give the children a voice and to strengthen their own sense of agency and participation. So what we do is we invite children between the ages of 7 and 13 typically to get together in a group of 10 and to draw a picture of their village. And you don't need any paper to do this, you can do it in the dirt. And if they're in an IDP camp or if they're in a village, they excitedly draw where everybody lives. And then if you ask them to locate on the picture where are the places that are dangerous or where accidents happen to children, they get very excited about it. So in Afghanistan, for example, the boys would draw a picture of a river that was raging and the bridge was out. And boys would make these very flimsy makeshift bridges that would then collapse and people would drown. Girls would draw pictures of things like no latrines and the kind of risks that I mentioned earlier to the girls as a result. After they do this risk mapping exercise, the children present their results to the village or to the IDP camp in the form of a role play. And the children love doing this. They act it out, it's creative, they get very excited. And the amazing thing is that the adults typically respond to it with great enthusiasm. And they almost always have an aha experience. And they say, oh my gosh, I had no idea that that's how young girls saw their issues. Or I had no idea that that's what boys saw as their issues. Sometimes we do the mapping by separate groups, girls versus boys, to heighten the attention to gender differences. In Afghanistan, this was not only required by the local gender circumstances and norms, but it was a very useful way of helping adults see that they really didn't understand the fact that the risks are gendered and that girls' risks are fundamentally different from boys. So out of this comes a process wherein adults are now feeling energized. And they're saying, we really need to work as a village or as a camp to try to address these risks. Well, we step into that, and our staff who are local people, try to say, this is not something that adults do for children, it is something that they do with children. And out of that comes the formation of a child well-being committee that typically consists of 10 people, half children, half adults. In a country like Afghanistan, again, we have gender-segregated committees of necessity, but in other places, we have men and women and boys and girls mixed together. And this committee is designed to be as inclusive as possible. So remember, we've typically done a lot of power mapping of the community. We've sort of learned who's at the table, who's not at the table. And so there's a lot of encouragement and exhortation, not just by us, but by local people to say, that family over there that's never been included in anything, it turns out that they really are interested in participating, and their subgroup of the poorest of the poor need to have a voice. And so this project does have a transformational element to it. It's aimed at ensuring greater inclusivity and more complete access and participation. When you take this approach, instead of thinking of child protection and psychosocial assistance as something that's done to local people, instead you see that it's something that's done with local people, and that children are very much agents of their own psychosocial well-being and their own child protection. So now you've got two tools in the toolbox, child-centered spaces and child well-being committees, that I think complement each other. They're both oriented towards community mobilization around children's needs.
Well, I know in Gujarat, I remember one of the coordination meetings, one of the NGOs was saying we can't seem to serve the men in this village. You know, they won't come for help, and it's like, yeah, big surprise. And one of the CRS representatives said, well, you know, what we're doing is we're teaching the women how to quietly support their husbands and, you know, provide them with the psychological support. And women tell us it's working really well. The men don't know they're receiving psychological support, but their wives are serving them, but in serving them, doing so with an understanding of the stress and traumatic stress and reactions, and you know that was working for them. In the Maldives, some of the islands were completely inundated by the tsunami, and so everything was destroyed. And one of the things that happened was anything electrical was destroyed. And so you have an entire island's electrical system and all the electrical materials, you know, gone. And one of the things that the American Red Cross did was to say, you know, would it be useful for you to have some sewing rooms? And they provided sewing machines and set up areas where the community could come and use sewing machines to recreate their clothes. This was a phenomenal, you know, step. I mean, the community thought this was the most incredible thing they'd seen.
The first workshop on March 11, we set up the working team. We set up the working team, and we also doing the second workshop. We try to work with other NGO, and we also doing the third workshop with the community leaders there. We told us that. The community leaders told us that this workshop is the first workshop that ever done, the first meeting among the community leaders. Yeah. And then this is the team building, that we give the youth there. We have 28 of the teenagers. We use them as a viral. So what we deliver to them, hopefully they can deliver to others. This is Tell Your Dream session. Tell Your Dream session is the way we assess their needs. What do their needs? And then they comes up with several ideas and several skills that they want to capture. Yeah, they want to upgrade. See here. Yeah, and then after that we teach them how to make a proposal so we can bring the proposal to Jakarta, and we talk to the donor what they need. Yeah. This is the proposal: chicken breeding, motorcycle workshop, coconut oil handicraft, honey, sewing and embroidery. And we add with one thing after this is English session. Yeah. English lessons. Yeah. English session. They learn to speak in English because so many foreigners come there.
No, is that also one of their dreams?
Yeah.
To learn English.
Yeah, to learn English. They said that this is the first time they can smile and laugh out loud.
We do not select
Yeah.
the group. How we select this group?
Oh, okay. Later. This is a seal of commitment.
What is written on that? What are they pledging?
Yeah. That we teenagers from Burung Village want to rebuild
To
our
the
lives
seven
with our
activities.
strength. Yeah.
And then for the activities of the
Very big about goodbye.
payment.
Yeah.